Brilliant. So thank you all for coming. This is an event between... God, you're just in time. It's an event between In Film, BCA and Wild Film. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Alfie. I'm Vice President of Wild Film. We're honoured to be joined today by Julian Hector, former head of the BBC Natural History Unit. So thank you very much for coming. Just before Julian says a few words to introduce himself, just a reminder that if you want to send in questions online during this talk, there's a Mentimeter link in the highlights of the Wild Film Instagram, or you can just ask at the end. But yeah, over to Julian to introduce himself.
Okay, thanks Alfie. So the format this afternoon, by the way, amazing you've come on a Saturday afternoon. It's kind of superhuman to do that. And but the format is to be in conversation with Alfie and with all of you. So I'm not going to say much in a sort of didactic way for that long, just 10 minutes or so. And what I want is you to, as I said to a couple of you before all of you came in, to pump me to an inch of my life about anything to do with these wildlife filmmaking world and opportunities and industry and any sort of gossip and stuff. You join, or you have aspirations to be wildlife filmmakers at such an important and interesting time. And maybe every generation is like that, but it really is. And we'll come on to sort of more about that a bit later. But it's a tough profession, but amazing. A little bit about me, and I coincidentally did zoology here. I actually started my degree in '78, so that's kind of when the pterosaurs are still flying. We can do things like that, and it seems like such a long time ago. And I was really excited to do zoology at a big university like this, because I sort of wanted bigness, if you know what I mean. I wanted a window that would let me go and sort of explore the world. And back in the 70s, everything was about sort of big and sort of getting out there. It's a little bit different now, but I was very, very excited. I absolutely loved flying, and as a sort of young man, and anything that flew as well. And I spent my early years in Kenya, which is where I lived, and they've got a really useful word, ndege, for aeroplane. But ndege also means, in Swahili, bird. It also means anything that's flying, whether at you or not. And that kind of word stuck with me, as a child and through life. And I always became intrigued with anything that flew. And one of my sort of heroes, you won't know of him, I don't suppose, but one of my heroes, who's now dead, was a professor here, a guy called Colin Pennicuik, and he was a kind of modern day Darwin in my mind, because he sort of forged new boundaries. He sort of merged physics with zoology, which I know seems probably very commonplace to you now, but it felt quite different then. And so he was studying the sort of mechanics of flight and everything flying. And anyway, his research group, they were flying pigeons, down these long university corridors through helium bubbles, and they were going to Antarctica and using really cool devices to film wave soaring of albatrosses, and they went to East Africa to look at thermal soaring of vultures. But you've got the picture, that as soon as you start interacting with people like that and you're looking for something sort of big to do yourself, as in a sort of big world, it seemed just the right thing to do. And it was in those early formative years of being an undergraduate here that I started getting really smitten by capture, I suppose, and cameras and the image and stuff. The studies that were looking at powered flight of pigeons through, it was a really remarkable guy who now works in a university in California, UCLA, and does a lot of work for the US military. He's my generation, so he's probably retiring soon. But he was flying pigeons through helium bubbles, and with an enormous array of SLR cameras in a sort of matrix, he would sort of strobe photograph the bird flying through the bubbles, and then could work out the vectors of all the individual helium bubbles, which were tiny, and in so doing could work out how the powered flight of a bird was propelling it through the air by looking at all the forces, physics and zoology coming together. Anyway, the photo array to do that science was really specky, and quite honestly, it's bloody difficult to do now. So that was sort of way ahead of its time. And anyway, I loved all that sort of stuff. And then a new head of department arrived, and he was called Brian Follett. He completely transformed sort of zoology, botany in Bristol. But he turned up with a really large group, and he was banging physiology and zoology together, and he was working on the environmental control of seasonal reproduction. And they talked about things like photoperiods, which is so new then, photoperiods and sort of the turning of the planet, and when an energetics, huge questions in energetics, when an animal should breed and when it shouldn't, and how it's controlled, and how that's linked to the ecosystem or the seasons that they're in. Anyway, all of this kind of inspired me to want to do science, and I never lost my sort of desire to want to capture the moment. And I was one of those lucky people. Sometimes you win when you get to a T-junction in life. And I applied when I graduated in zoology. I applied to the British Antarctic Survey, and it was like a sort of blink. Suddenly, I was on a ship heading to Antarctica for 3 years, and to do my PhD on albatrosses down on South Georgia. And back in 1981, when I joined the British Antarctic Survey, believe you me, my equivalent of all of you sitting there thought I was a total nutter. It wasn't that place, that people aspired to go. Nobody was going down there really. The British Antarctic Survey was a tiny operation. Remember, this was the year of the Falklands War 40 years ago. And so the British Antarctic Survey was like a sort of tiny research operation then. And it was in the sort of pristine world of South Georgia, and where I wasn't to know, and I was there with two other people, I wasn't to know then, and my mates weren't to know, that we were the last generation to see animals like albatrosses and petrels and many penguin species in their last period of global abundance. So ever since then, the numbers of Antarctic seabirds have plummeted. Albatross numbers, penguin numbers have gone down by about 50%. Breeding birds have gone down by in those 40 years. And so in the subsequent years, when I was sending teams down to film them, it was a completely different world to the one that I was in. But back then, I took an old wind clockwork film camera called a Bolex, and which had it would run 15 minutes worth of 16mm film. I also took down what was then the state-of-the-art audio device called a Sony Walkman Pro, and which recorded waveform, which recorded sort of broadcast quality analog audio. And the upshot of all that was that whilst I was doing my work on my PhD, I was filming stuff, and I was also recording things. And these made various shows that people were making. Dovetailed at this time, I'm sure these are series that the history is kind of important, but in 1979, David Attenborough broadcast his first blockbuster Landmark, and these big landmarks in subsequent years, right up until now, were to be called super landmarks. And he in '79 he broadcast Life on Earth, and then 4 years later he broadcast The Living Planet. And Life on Earth was about life histories of animals. Living Planet was about ecosystems, and I was in a place where those sorts of theories were really hungry for images, and so some of the things which I did sort of made those shows. it was also an incredibly important time that you are all still surfing the wave of. Because before then, honestly, it was a joke. So natural history on television were people that you might never have heard of, like a children's show called Animal Magic, which everyone loved, but it was just animals in zoos. Even Attenborough was doing a thing called Zoo Quest, which was about whizzing around the world and grabbing animals for London Zoo and bringing them back. And Life on Earth was literally era-defining, where this extraordinary presenter stood up, ants running up his pants type of thing, in two-shot with beautifully shot natural history. And we're still doing it. And hopefully you lot are going to be still doing it. And I'm going to be nothing but really encouraging that you do that. And the reason why I mention all of that, and it's an important sort of kicking off point for us talking about things, was the thing that mattered then was the extreme close-up. That's what we were all going to do. We just wanted the extreme close-up. And audiences, and they were huge. I mean, 20 million people were watching Life on Earth. It's unbelievably large audiences. But what everyone wanted was closer still. And there's so many sort of cameos, sort of images of natural history on television in sort of drama sets, where you see a whole eye of a bird or something like that. And all of our ambition was about developing technology and going on field trips where getting close and closer and bringing that close up was the important part of storytelling. And it's all changed now. I think it's still important, but we'll talk about that. But it's all changed. And one thing that hasn't changed, though, and I hope it resonates with all of you, is that we're all united. We're all conjoined, if you like, because we want to get close to the natural world ourselves. We really want to get close ourselves, and we kind of want to share that with audiences. And that drive to be close yourself and want to share that closeness with audiences will lead you to success, I promise. So if you want to be wildlife filmmakers, if you want to be content producers in natural history, that desire to get close, never let go of it. Your ambition to do that and your field skills and your ability to take people into the field or to learn from the field will be your silver bullet, I promise. And if you are already, because you're already so well connected, but if you're talking to companies like the Natural History Unit, the NHU, Silverback, Humblebee, Wildstar, Plimsoll, Freeborn, True to Nature, Offspring, you know them all, I'm sure you do. Everybody in those companies here in Bristol will have a desire to get close themselves. So there we are, and things have changed, things have changed quite a bit. And so now, the big question is what's important to say. So with all the big series that have come out recently, up until the last sort of 5 years or so, it's all about being sort of awe and wonder in natural history. In some ways, it's been about fieldcraft. It's been about it's been about getting close, but it's been about unique animal behaviour or unique plant behaviour. It's been about giving that promise to audiences. But meanwhile, inescapably, there's been a problem, with the environment as the sort of human population trashes it, and we show no ability whatsoever to be able to share the earth, with the animals and plants and fungi that live on it as well. And so the bite of the story is beginning to change from the filmmakers. It's no longer becoming that easy just to go out and film blue chip unique animal behaviour, and that when actually you want to be starting to say other things. And And then there's a rub, obviously, with audience palatability of that. But the real thing that I want to just sort of summarise there is that the innovation in storytelling is your second sort of superpower, if you like. Getting close to nature, wanting to share that with audiences is your first one. And the second one is being innovative and imaginative and creative with storytelling. So it was okay, not that long ago, to be a sort of voice of God, if you like. You could make a film and you could sort of boom down from above and say what's going on, with the images. You all know that doesn't work anymore. You don't just describe what you can see already on television. So storytelling has shifted from that sort of voice of God sort of demeanour to character-led, emotional storytelling where audiences can make connections with the characters which you're showing to them. In a way, it's taking skills from soap operas, from continuing drama, as it's called in the industry, to tell those stories, to make you want to care. And we can talk about one or two of those in a moment. And that storytelling has changed, I reckon, has only really changed since 2017. I think Planet Earth 2, which came out in 2017 on the BBC, was the first super landmark of all of them, including Nat Geo, including Discovery, including the streamers that were to come, were the first ones where emotional storytelling, where drama as a storytelling device was put in play. And it was the first time in 2017 with Planet Earth 2 that there was a small nod to the environmental crisis, to the biodiversity collapse which is happening. A tiny nod, kind of retrofitted onto the back of it. Come 2 years later, when we put out Blue Planet 2, the whole thing had shifted. We had embedded sort of environment more into the emotional storytelling. If any of you have seen Blue Planet 2, you'll be aware of the plastics campaign, which probably was the first viral environmental campaign driven from a landmark natural history television series or any single episode. And it's because there was imagery, if you remember, of baby sperm whales knocking around lumps of plastic floating around in the sea, and then followed by stories of seabird chicks whose guts are absolutely full of thrown away plastic, and had resonated with audiences. So that was 2019 that was the first time. And then I think incrementally those sort of environmental stories atop unique animal behaviour have started to sort of ramp up. And that is the wave that you're all on. You are on this wave of working out how natural history is made palatable to large audiences. Ask me about impact producing later if you want, but because that's a different audience. But how natural history can appeal to wide audiences still, which it obviously does because there's a universality about it. But how you tell those important stories which need to be told, which are different to what they were in the past. So that was my sort of introduction, and in a way my challenge to you. It's a complex old business. Money's hard to come by to make natural history content. I think you've all had a go at it, and I've seen some films which have been amazing. Whether you've been the makers of that content, I don't know. But you all know that as much as we all love to make it look incredibly easy, that you just sort of walk out there and start filming and you've got it, and come back again. That the time and skill and effort it takes to film unique animal behaviour, to film plants, to film fungi, to film them in imaginative ways, compelling ways, low budget, big budget. It's difficult, and to wrap right up, that I started out wanting to do this because I wanted big things, because that was kind of how the world was set up to go out and look at big things and bring big things back to audiences. But I think it's quite different now. I think some of the biggest stories are being carried by some of the smallest living things out there. So there's another challenge. And that'll be a sort of big breakthrough when, if you like, the little things that run the world are the characters in those emotional and immersive stories that are going to be told in the future. So that's my introduction for now. And so we can open up to any questions, and I'll field anything at all. I know we're on camera, but any gossip you want me to tell, I'll say it.
Brilliant. So it's a fascinating career, and I'm really looking forward to asking you these questions. I might recap on some points, but I wanted to just go back to your career and how you got into being a head of natural history. So growing up in Kenya, is that where your interest in wildlife first developed? I imagine the wildlife's quite different out of that. Yeah,
not necessarily. Back in, it was such a long time ago. That's I was born at an early age thing, and when we were living in Kenya for 10 years or so, the sort of animals that you associate with East Africa and the plants that you associate with Africa were sort of all around us, and so I was very lucky to live in a very sort of immersed world. But I think I got into natural history and wanting to tell stories about the natural world through reading animal stories.
Interesting.
I've always loved, the imagination stretching, sort of projecting onto sort of animal superpowers, if you like, and so fiction is amazing, with that, and so I think it was more literature that did it rather than being sort of amongst it. I think I was like anybody actually, that if I don't think I naturally pick things up. Do you? I know people, because naturalists are amazing people who are naturalists. They observe and they record and they pick up and they draw and they do this, and they don't fear anything like that. And I know quite a few people in the industry, who will always pick up stuff, and that hasn't been me. So I think it's literature.
Yeah, and something that probably carried on into the degree as well.
Yeah.
When you were at university, you did zoology, as much of us in the room also did. How has that course changed? Was it different back then?
Oh
I
my God.
No coding back then.
It probably was different. I was I used to interview to join the life science course here. If you apply, we were interviewed, and I remember being interviewed and then being sort of presented with lots of sort of bugs in boxes and just told to say something about them. And I think then a great chunk of zoology was quite taxonomic and systematically done. So if you weren't a bit of a train spotter, as I wasn't, I struggled a bit. I started getting a bit distracted, and I have to tell you, I have to ask a sensitive question. Can you remember the first lecture in life sciences that you had in your first year? Can you go back to that? Can you think? I can remember, I'd worked so hard, and I can remember the first lecture of the first year, of the first term, of the first everything. I walked the lectures and everything else, and it was a lecture on cell membranes. Now I know cell membranes are really important, and I know how complex they are. But I remember this chap talking about lipid bilayers and sort of protein bobbing around in it and all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to know about big things. So I think that's all changed now. I think now, joking apart, I think now you're much more analytical, you're much more self-critical, you challenge your lecturers all the time, you are sort of fascinated with new innovations, and you can feel where science plays in society. And I think it was different then. I think back in the late 70s, it still felt quite taxonomic, and I wasn't that sort of person.
Brilliant. Outside of the course, do you have any fond memories from uni? What were the societies different?
Oh yeah, I got very distracted. I got so distracted. Remember, I told you in my introduction that I love anything to do with flying. I always loved birds and dragonflies and sort of things and whizzing around that, and flying underwater. I've always been fascinated by that. But I joined a thing. Does it still exist? Called the University Air Squadron. Does that ring a bell? The universities used to have this sort of contingent of the Royal Air Force within the university, and I think universities now amalgamate them, and you do it. But when I was in my first year, I applied and got into the University Air Squadron. I couldn't believe it. I literally couldn't believe I was going to be taught to fly for nothing at university. And so I joined that, and which utterly distracted me, which meant I was on a really bad footing academically quite quickly. And I imagine, like a lot of you, I also learned to dive. The University of Bristol Diving Society was a really active one.
Yes, that's still a thing.
Yeah, and there was the Biological Society, of course, and the other area which I used to really love was the Department of Philosophy, and that they had wonderful sort of societies about which help me understand why you want to know things.
Yeah. Have you been up in a hot air balloon? That's very Bristol for flying.
I've never been up in a hot air balloon, and I don't think I could do it now. I'm not sure. Age, I've become very vertiginous with age. You couldn't really dangle me off a cliff. I bet all of you can do that easily, can you? You can all abseil and film at the same time, swinging across and everything else. I simply can't do it. But anything with wings and anything which I know is powering it, no problem.
Cool. So moving on to the British Antarctic Survey, could you talk a little bit about the project that you're working on? Because it was described as pioneering, and it uncovered why albatrosses breed every 2 years.
It's amazing. So albatrosses are amazing animals, and the British Antarctic Survey is an extraordinary organisation. After the Falklands War in '82, the British government sort of pumped prime British Antarctic Survey with loads of money, and now it's part of NERC, obviously, and it's a hugely complex and highly professional organisation. It was then, but it's really big now. But I was very much inspired by the chap I cited earlier, who's doing all this work on the environmental control of reproduction. And I went to South Georgia, funded by BAS, to see whether we could shine a light on why it was that albatrosses, which is very rare in birds, breed every other year. They sort of take a year off, if you like. And when most seasonal animals, they are triggered by some seasonal event, and they reproduce, and then they recover, if you like, or raise young, and then come back again the next year. And albatrosses are very long-lived. They can live to upward of 60 years. And the big ones breed every other year. And so what I was doing was I was put onto an island called Bird Island, which still had the longest, and it's continued for another 40 years, it had the longest running set of ecological data, sort of demographic data of these seabirds. They've been studied then for 40 years, or 30 years, originally by Metmen that used to plonk themselves down in that part of the world, observing these birds. So I was that generation who went into, which you're so familiar with now, into big data, and so went into this big demographic data, and then with known age, known individual albatrosses, I ran around for 4 seasons collecting blood samples from them at different stages of their breeding cycle and other times of their life, and then we looked at their the signal within their sort of reproductive physiology, if you like, reproductive health and that stuff, against the environment, against their reproductive success, and whether they're raising chicks or not, that sort of thing. So that's what it was. So it was the title was, if I remember, The Reproductive Endocrinology of Free-Living Albatrosses.
Wow. So later in your career, did you ever suggest albatrosses for a sequence, for a documentary?
Do you know, I've pushed albatrosses massively. Did any of you see Seven Worlds, One Planet? Does that ring a bell? You all seen that one? If I focus you down a bit more, do you remember a sequence where a grey-headed albatross was ignoring its chick, which had fallen off a nest? Do you remember that? There's gorgeous, great big fluffy albatross chick. They only have one every other year. And the wind had blown it off its nest. They're sight faithful. And the audience, and this was the sequence, the audience were absolutely aghast that the albatross wasn't feeding the chick, and wasn't helping the chick back on the nest, just sort of sitting there, sort of in a completely sort of goofy state. And it touches on what I was saying a little bit earlier. If you remember that sequence, that's an absolutely masterclass in emotional storytelling. So there, if you think about it, the images are just an albatross chick on the ground, an albatross parent doing absolutely fuck all, and an empty nest, and then the sequence followed it, and eventually the albatross chick clambered back into the nest 6 minutes later in broadcast time, which is massive, I tell you. And then as soon as the chick got back into the nest, the parent started feeding it. And of course, it wasn't told in the sequence, but the purpose of that is that with such low reproductive rates and only having a single chick, which both parents rear every other year, an albatross parent can't afford to give in to soliciting of other chicks. So an albatross parent will wander to its nest in the colony and will only go to its nest and will only feed the chick that's occupying its nest. So it won't give food to any other chicks soliciting on the way. So that's why it ignored the chick that was out of the nest.
Do they recognise that a chick would not be there if it is in its nest? If it had happened to walk into
What a good question. I think that there's an awful lot of individual interaction going on between parent and chick the whole time. And I reckon we've never done it, I reckon if you'd swap chicks, I reckon there'd be a problem. They don't feed other chicks, they won't do that. I think if there's enough time for parent-chick bonding and the chick could survive that time, I think what it would do is that it would start pair bonding, and it might take a few days, and the parent might go off without feeding it and then come back again. But then it probably would start feeding it. But they don't do that though, because the chicks are so hefted to their own nest, and they don't clamber into another one. So it's awful if they get blown off. The grey-headed albatross chick is that tall, and the wandering albatross chick is about 1 metre tall. And they're quite hard. They're like skittles. They're quite hard to blow over.
Must have been quite a gut-wrenching moment for the cameraman as well.
Yes,
that.
John Aitchison, have you heard of him? He's an amazing cameraman, and it's a wonderful piece of camera operator craft. You know, the wonderful men and women that film. That this ability for a natural history camera operator to observe and be patient and to wait and to record what happens. You know, don't get in the way. And yes, John didn't intervene. It worked out.
Yeah. While you were out there doing your research, you were caught up in the Falklands War. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what happened there.
Gosh, the war. The war. So there were only a handful of us on Bird Island, and 4 of us on Bird Island, and we were all destined to go home. We'd been there for 6 months, and we were going to be picked up by a British Antarctic Survey ship and go home. A couple of months prior to that, we'd noticed some weird activity around South Georgia. We didn't have much of a view Bird Island, because Bird Island is a small island off the northwest tip of South Georgia. South Georgia, I'm sure you know, is about 1,000 miles east of the tip of Tierra del Fuego, so it's right in the middle of the South Atlantic. And the Falklands obviously were a massive bone of contention for the Argentinians, still are. South Georgia's part of the Falkland Island dependency. And we started noticing Argentinian aircraft sort of buzzing us, which is really unusual because we were dropped off 6 months before and didn't see a single thing. I mean, and there's no mobile phones or anything. We had 100 words of telex a month that we could send to, like, in my case, a girlfriend or something like that who, as you can probably gather, didn't stick around. And we had to send that by radio to a receiver on South Georgia, where there was a larger number of people who could send that by satellite as a telex message. You know, like, just the next step up from bloody ticker tape. And with that, we'll be radioing South Georgia quite a lot, saying we've been seeing this military activity around. And I can tell it longer and better, but to cut a sort of slightly longer story short, they radioed us to say that they'd been invaded. There'd been this almighty fight in Grytviken Bay where some Marines had been dropped off by an Antarctic research ship called Endurance. The Argentinians had beaten the Marines, although the Marines had sunk a couple of ships in the process of fighting. And then all of them were taken prisoner, and it was just us left. And they couldn't land on Bird Island. They couldn't land where we were because it was so rugged. And then we stuck it out there with all sorts of interesting drama until the end of the war, when we were eventually picked up by the Royal Navy, and then we sort of essentially hitchhiked home on helicopters and warships. I rather quite liked.
Yeah.
All young people like that sort of thing. And but we saw a great deal of activity. We didn't know what was going to happen to our friends, but of course they were fine. The Argentinians looked after them incredibly well. All the soldiers were eventually released in a prisoner swap, and they sort of went back and forth. There's some very famous stories that the Navy dropped a platoon of SAS soldiers onto a glacier on South Georgia, and they got stuck there, and they couldn't do anything. And we were having to sort of, lots of advice was given about how to get off this glacier and how to rescue them, and they were famously rescued. It was kind of, if it wasn't for the tragedy of life being lost, it was kind of a very old fashioned war in foreign lands type of feel. Doesn't really wouldn't happen now, I don't think, in the same way. But we all got completely sort of caught up. So we eventually came back after over a year of being away, and without being resupplied or anything. So we had to start being quite innovative about keeping going. And we found a 45-gallon drum of dried cabbage left there in the 1950s by some Met team that had been there and everything else. And we sort of hydrated it, and it was absolutely disgusting. I couldn't eat it. Lobbed a bit of it in the sea, and no Antarctic wildlife ate it either. So we chucked the whole thing, not the barrel, but the contents, all this dried cabbage, over a cliff. And it created this sort of green slick that sort of drifted around the island. And so we just carried on eating the sort of dried food that we had. We weren't suffering particularly, but then we got picked up. We got picked up in May or June, I think it was, which was near the end of the war. We couldn't give any messages back to home because there was no radio contact with anything, and so we were, being the sort of age we were and just sort of fairly gung-ho, none of us there had much of a thought about what people at home would be thinking about the fact that we hadn't come home for months and months on end in a war zone. I could talk. That's the Falklands, but we were the small group of scientists that were there. That if ever you read about the Falklands War, they'll talk about some scientists, and we were the scientists on South Georgia.
Well, speaking of the Antarctic wildlife, I heard a story about Sir Peter Scott, who was, of course, the founder of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust in Slimbridge, which we go to quite regularly to society. But I heard a story about him asking you to bring back some South Georgia pintail.
Oh, South Georgia pintail, yeah. Well, that's obviously a collection of wildfowl, and during that same time, we collected some South Georgia pintail chicks on his request. We thought it was a slightly zoo-questy thing to do, and we brought them back all the way through the war, and they were given their own consignment number and everything, and they were treated like the most sort of precious commodity. And then when we all got back, we then presented them to Peter and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and the generations are still there. I mean, 5 bazillion generations later. It's funny, if ever I go back there and look at the pintail, there are very few collection animals there now, but they've still got the pintail, I think, in a South Atlantic.
Yeah, we'll have to go and have a look next time we're about. What was the route then following that you took to get into being a producer at the Natural History?
So I did a PhD and everything else, and I stayed in academia for a bit. I was really keen on the media, and something which I'll advise all of you as well. I just wanted to do it, and I summoned this sort of self-starting side in me to sort of talk to and be close to people who were doing it. And I'd had this amazing start by doing a PhD on South Georgia, and it's got nothing to do with the PhD at all, which I'm very proud of, but it's about being close to specky animals. And so I used to do lots of radio recordings, which I would do interviews, with Radio 4, and did a bit of camera work, which I wasn't, that brilliant at, but I loved it. It wasn't that brilliant at. And I stayed in academia for a bit. I had a lectureship and things like that, and I made a job jump from being a university lecturer to going backwards, if you like, to being a researcher in a natural history production. And that's a decision that I made, and I went there. Now it's terrible. I mean, obviously, personal contacts are really important, and any opportunity to seize them. But the best thing is to see advertised roles, or if you somehow have privileged access to jobs, but try and become a junior or a researcher on a production, and I mean, a runner, obviously. Sometimes production management is quite a good way to get in. Don't scoff at that. The whole sort of administration of delivering films, which is all part of production. But these are sort of good routes in. And as I said 15 minutes ago, field skills and a desire to tell a story. And I didn't really realise it then, but I had field skills. I hadn't clocked how valuable it was. I could walk into a production and tell them how to film stuff because I'd seen it, or I'd met people who'd got close, and I really wanted to tell a story, and those two commodities, I promise you, are still like catnip to people who might hire you. That field skills and a desire to tell a story.
Did you find that the qualification in diving also helped with the research?
Yeah, not really. I mean, I have done diving for work. You all know you have to upgrade them to HSC, equivalent to HSC 4 commercial diving if you want to be paid to dive and to work for stuff. I did all that. I think, I still think it's a burning desire to tell a story. If you want to focus on underwater stuff, technically, So you want to be a camera op or assist camera operations or assist diving operations, then obviously it goes without saying, your diving experience is really important. And you need quite a lot of experience, by the way, because by the time I was sort of being paid to go underwater, as it were, I'd already logged about 1,000 sea dives. So it's not just about the ticket. You kind of have to be the real thing and do it. But I still think storytelling, a desire to tell a story, and jumping to your careers now, be able to show something, even if it hasn't worked that well, but just sort of, I tried this, I tried that, I want to do this, I want to do that, is vital, really, really important.
So you're credited as bringing live natural history to programming to Radio 4. Oh yeah. And Sir David Attenborough described you as one of the most inventive producers in radio.
How nice.
How have you found that radio differs from television in regards to telling those stories?
Oh, what a good question. Radio is so civilised, isn't it? Do you think? It's it's got so much authority. Speak. Do you all listen to podcasts and think? Do you find it's got? I'm sure you're very selective, but do you find they're so authoritative? You're sort of sitting, and speech radio sort of had so much sort of authority. So, in a nutshell, that's all about conversation, isn't it? I'm sure the podcasts that you listen to, the speech ones, are just about conversation, about ideas. And one of the things that we brought to radio, which seemed to be so far ahead, is that we wanted to do all that sort of blue chippy stuff, which is so important now. On radio, we tried to get really close to nature and record nature so that radio audiences could hear nature. And sound is so powerful. The sound of nature is so powerful. It's just creeping into telly, as you know now, with a couple of series which can be done on sound. And it's about conversation. Ultimately, you can't hold a radio show together just on the animal without. You might be able to think but you kind of need experts. It's conversation. I think that's what it is. And podcasts really exploit that. It used to only be a couple of speech radio stations. Television, modern television is so. Television's hard. It really is hard. And the reason why it's hard is that it has to be so simple. And it takes a huge amount of effort to simplify a story and that it's really compelling. And drama producers and directors and film directors do this so well, they know. And so with television, there's much more character development. Modern natural history storytelling is about character development, is about jeopardy, is about immersion, emotional connected storytelling, and it's hard.
So, with radio and television, have you faced many challenges in terms of the stories the news that you're telling? Have you faced any challenges with how they're represented in the media, or even trying to get those stories into sort of the general public's view?
Yeah, of course. It's about everything with broadcast, isn't it? It's a balance between appealing to audiences and wanting to tell the story you want to tell, and hoping that your story will resonate with audiences. And you don't work in isolation. You work in big teams with editors and people who control the content, and the commissioners and the controllers and everything else. And sometimes it's just incredibly difficult to get your story that you want to tell on air. And the very complex stories around the demise of nature are very difficult to get on air in a way that's palatable, that audiences will pick up and act. But in a broader sense, sort of selling an idea is all part of the skill. You need to be able to sell something. At some point, someone's going to buy an idea off you and say they want you to make that, or you want you to be part of the team. and you have to get that sort of selling bit in you to pitch it and to get it through. And it's difficult. You'll have more nays than yays. You just will. But keep going. Just keep doing it.
Yes, I've got a few questions about pitching coming up. I wanted to touch on your work on the Panorama Ivory Wars out of Africa, because that was very much an expose style of filmmaking.
Yeah.
How does that differ from your blue chips?
Oh, so different. Are any of you sort of interested in sort of environmental storytelling as opposed to blue chip? So an element, if I can call it, of environmental storytelling is original journalism, with a big J, so that you are chasing baddies basically, and it takes a lot of balls to do that, and you have to do it well because you're in an awful lot of trouble if you get it wrong. And so with Ivory Wars or a show like that. The premise of Ivory Wars was chasing the money. So elephants were being slaughtered for their ivory. Who was paying for it? Where was the money going? What was driving that business? And the investigation showed that the money left Africa very quickly and sort of landed in China. And it was sort of a loop like that. Virtually no money was left in Africa, if you like, but for the poachers, which is illegal, and anybody in there. So it was it's a sort of criminal river to there. And you have to be forensic with your filming and your work. A program like that involves an awful lot of secret filming, which you have to get permission for because it's basically illegal wherever you do it. And so you have to get permission to be illegal because it's in the public interest to do that. So secret filming in China to see how ivory was being traded from one hand to another. And blue chip series are about, so blue chip is a bit like these big landmarks we've been talking about, which many companies make now for many broadcasters. But a landmark blue chip show is about unique animal plant behaviour. It's about extreme ambition. It's about strong characterisation of animal or plant characters. If you've watched things like Life of Plants, you'll know what I'm talking about there. And in that storytelling that we've been talking about, that sort of immersive, emotional, character-led storytelling, with blue chip, you have the opportunity to bring those wonderful sort of human dimensions in, like humour, for example. And you've all watched shows where, or episodes where there's been funny things, and that's very much blue chip. Blue chip's about time. It's not unusual for a big landmark series for each episode, the budget of each episode to be sort of 2 or 3 million an hour, and that pays for time, and they can be made over 4 years or so. A big landmark blue chip series across its 4-year cycle might hire across its cycle, not all as permanent jobs, but will hire 1,200 people or so, and all over the world in different roles, and the basic team will probably be about 30, say here in Bristol, and then hiring people everywhere else. The sort of journalistically led documentary where you're chasing baddies you might just keep it to about half a dozen people with a much lower budget. Everything is much more cloak and dagger with that.
Yes, I've just recently watched the Orca Black, White and Gold expose, which hopefully we're going to screen to the society soon.
You must.
But one thing I was wondering, watching that, was how did the production crews go about gaining the trust of these people committing these illegal activities?
Well, it takes time. It takes time. Have you all been involved? I think you're all undergraduates. Have you all been involved in researching stories yet? With wildlife filmmaking and sort of trying to get access. And everything about documentary filmmaking is access. It's slightly different to the sort of big landmark natural history or natural history features. Okay, you've got to go to get close to animals or plants, whatever, in certain environments, but all documentaries are won or lost on how good your access is. Often access is with people, and researchers and program makers and the journo can win the trust. You can, as I say, if it's about secret filming or you're disguising your identity, then in this country you have to get special permissions to do that. Otherwise, to get some sort of protection from the broadcaster. But it's time. Doesn't always work.
I'm very much asking for myself, but do the routes to get into that style of filmmaking differ from regular natural history?
Yeah. So if you want to chase baddies and I really advise you, I really recommend, however you do it, to go and find a course on journalism and investigative journalism, original journalism, because there are lots of skills in journalism. It doesn't matter whether it's written, radio, or TV journalism. The point is that you are seeking a truth in a forensic way, and you need to, and there's lots of important reasons why you have to be certain that you've got a truth, and you need to be trained into that. You need to be trained in law, in libel, in defamation, in all sorts of things like that. You also need to be very good at looking after yourself as well. But journalism is a really good way to do that. And then I would say that being a documentary producer, even if it isn't sort of if it isn't sort of raw investigative journalism, just sort of documentary making. It is all about access, and I reckon it's the most difficult bit of telly to get into. And if you're sort of broadcast savvy yourselves, if you're beginning to research stories, film stories, put them on your own accounts and everything else, you might be halfway there. But my advice is. If it's that kind of environmental documentary making, make that decision that that's what you want to do, that end of broadcast you want to be in as early as possible.
Have you experienced much personal backlash and stuff like that?
Much?
Like personal backlash for yourself?
If by trying to get people to conform and join in a show and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess just that kind of like, can you talk about defamation?
Oh yeah.
How much have you?
I've had nothing against people. I've been incredibly scared on several occasions where you're holding people to account and you think the accusations are strong enough that you have, and you've got sort of backing to do that. But when people who you're holding to account start fighting back, with their lawyers, that's why it's a great advantage to work with a very large company like the BBC or something, where if you're in the right, you'll have the sort of legal backing that you need. But things like Ivory Wars are scary. I've got a slightly funny story actually with Ivory Wars, because we collaborated with Panorama, who are hard-nosed news journalists, to make it. And we were sort of slightly wet behind the ears, naive natural history filmmakers, and collaborating with Panorama, who are very hard-nosed, and they manipulated us as much as they were manipulating everybody else to get access to the stories. So they so skillfully manipulated us to give them access to all sorts of parts of the world which they were doing, but in fact they were using that access to do secret filming and all sorts of things. We thought they were doing something else, and so you've got the idea. You're a player, on it. But the second half of your question really is people are, and rightly so, can be very, very sensitive if you feel that you haven't portrayed them accurately, and they have an absolute right to reply with that, both in every way. And that's why you have to be very, very careful with the whole skill of editing, because the fundamental rule with editing, if it's people and ideas and voices, is you can speed up what someone is saying, and you can clip whole statements that they might be saying. But what you absolutely cannot do is change the sense of what someone is saying. And if you do that, you'll be exposed to libel and defamation big time.
So as the head of the Natural History Unit, you've obviously done a lot of work with David Attenborough. Could you talk about how you first met him, what it's like working with him? We usually have a cardboard cutout of him at our...
Is that the one I see in the Life Science building?
Yeah,
staring out the window. I've cycled past, so for years I've been seeing him.
Yes, we've always had him in our...
It's really good... Well, I haven't worked with Dave very much, in as much as because it's very flat, but I've always been the sort of boss of these people making these big landmarks who've been working directly with him. But I met David a long time ago, and we I actually met him on location whilst he was filming the living world, what was Attenborough's The Living Planet, and he was filming on the Falklands, and I was actually on the Falklands at the time in the early 80s, and the young David Attenborough was there. I don't think he ever sort of remembered me from that moment. I used him in radio quite a bit in the 90s, and he likes radio, and he'd always say yes. I remember I did a feature on radio on the house that Darwin lived in, and so David is absolutely passionate about Darwin and the sort of heritage of Darwin, and was very keen to sort of help make this show about Darwin's home, to save it and to preserve it.
Yes.
Sticking with radio, when Sir David had a bit of a lull in his, which is hard to imagine, a bit of a lull in his TV broadcast career. He'd done all these planets and umpteen other things, and things went quiet for a bit. And it was a good moment to talk to him about radio. And we did did 20 amazing shows called David Attenborough's Life Stories. And he's the most consummate writer and storyteller. He's so original. And I remember sitting with him in his house, which is sublime in the extreme, and talking about ideas, and he liked all these ideas about these stories that he's had in his broadcast career, and then he came up with 20 more, every single one of them completely different to the ones that we discussed, and he's so original, David. And then I've worked with him obviously as head of the Natural History Unit a great deal in terms of just making sure he works for us, because he works for everybody of course, but making sure that he stays with us and to help him. And he's 98 now. And I spoke to him only, I was in touch with the household only very recently actually, and he's well and still doing commentary. Someone mentioned Asia, someone in the audience mentioned Asia, and he's just narrated Asia. He does his narration from home, and which is thanks to the COVID era actually. Yeah. They got all set up at home, and he does all that still. He's amazing. He's a messiah. He's the chosen one. He's been here before. He must have been here before. He just knows what to do. He's known what to do since a young boy. I've talked to him about that. I don't know about any of you. Credit to you if you do. But he was collecting fossils in Leicestershire where he grew up, and as young as 8, and beautifully labelling them and storing them in boxes, and he's still got them exactly as he had them in his home.
Wow.
And he's got the most wonderful sort of collection. He is the sort of epitome of a natural history and broader, but collector, and I believe in a unique way has never overexposed himself. And we love him. We all love him. He's the only person I've been to where I've been to events where 4 generations of people have been screaming. And he sort of wonders what it's all about. But it's so amazed by him. And so he'll he's still. There'll be plans almost certainly for his centenary, which isn't that long away. But yes, he's just like the cardboard cutout.
Yeah,
he's got that.
He's the wild film equivalent of a rock star, realistically.
He's cooler. He's. We've worked with A-lister actors to narrate, and they're amazing. They're wonderful. And actors, men and women, they love narrating natural history, and it's a wonderful thing, for an actor to be paid for their voice. And it's, I believe, it's not only fantastic to have very well-known, gifted voices narrating natural history, but it's an honour for them to be asked as well. So it's actually the most wonderful relationship to have an actor. But no actor, in my experience, has been able to find those pictures that David can find in narrating natural history. Even now, and he can go up. He can go up all these levels of sort of concern and emotion and stress, and then so skillfully sort of come back down again to sort of datum point, Sir David Attenborough. And actors that we've worked with can only do 1 or 2 of those lifts and then back again. And he does, he's extraordinary. So, he's a messiah.
You've got an in conversation with David Attenborough that's available on YouTube. Go and check it out.
Oh, right.
In that, it was for the 60th anniversary of the NHU.
Oh,
and
great.
In that, you asked him if there were any sequences he'd worked on in particular that made him emotional. And he talked in particular about the baby elephant that was crippled.
Yeah.
I was wondering what sequences you've worked on that you found particularly emotional to see brought to the screen, or if you have any documentaries in particular that you're quite fond of when you look back.
So radio and television. I don't know whether you have come across it, but something I was really proud of on Radio 4 was that I developed this format called Tweet of the Day. And Tweet of the Day was 90 seconds of audio where someone said something absolutely lovely about a bird, in a British bird, but actually it's gone overseas now, a British bird, and then you heard unadulteratedly the sound of that bird calling or singing. And Tweet of the Day was put just at the start of the news agenda on Radio 4, so it was at sort of 90 seconds to 6. Farming Today was cut short, which has always been sort of wonderful, sort of really satisfying for me. And then Tweet of the Day sort of led up to the start of the Today programme on weekdays. And I've always been really proud of that because it still runs and there's a little bit of natural history. Just 90 seconds of natural history ahead of the news agenda, whatever's coming. It's really uplifting. I found the stories around plastic are ones that really sort of gripped me in Blue Planet 2. That was the thing that really got me. We didn't think that we would be able to get plastic into the shows, but they were, and we didn't think that they'd be heavily publicised. But getting images of sort of beautiful animals sort of wrestling with plastic and evidence of plastic sort of reducing survival success of offspring, with a huge landmark series being watched by 13 million people, which Blue Planet 2 was the last big audience of that type that there was. And the way that it was picked up, was massive for me, because I think plastic became a global agenda then. We all became aware of that. I was first aware of plastic way back when I was working on albatrosses on Bird Island in the early 80s, because albatross parents would regurgitate their food to chicks, and even then albatrosses were regurgitating things like flip-flops and things. We reckoned there was about, in the 80s, we did a sort of back of fag packet, we thought there was about 10,000 pieces of floating plastic on every square kilometre of sea surface. And it's turned out to be 2 orders of magnitude wrong today. So plastic is a very big one. I made a Natural World, which was a wonderful single strand film about seals, and we filmed the whole thing underwater, largely underwater, and we developed rebreathers. If you're into diving, we developed rebreathers so that we could stay underwater for very long periods of time, and we actually built hides underwater and everything, and so went in there. They didn't generate bubbles or anything, and because they didn't make bubbles, we didn't make noise. We could stay down there for hours.
Wow.
These seals stopped being sort of inquisitive animals to people, and started sort of behaving. And I remember filming a dance that we'd never seen before, filmed in Orkney actually, of 2 grey seals intertwined with each other, sort of dancing like this underwater. And I was completely moved by the privilege of being able to be so close to that. That made the show.
Yeah. And that brings us quite nicely onto Blue Planet 2, which I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, which the Blue Planet 2 effect obviously then led you to address the UN in 2019 and then be awarded the Chatham House Prize by the Queen along with David Attenborough. That kind of impact is something that most filmmakers can only dream of. Can you describe the process behind the Blue Planet 2 effect and what that sort of had on the general public?
Yeah, Blue Planet 2, which was executive produced by a guy called James Honeyborn, who's got his own independent company now. And Blue Planet 2 was the first series of huge impact, of sort of super landmark status that we made, that integrated the most modern of storytelling, sort of emotional, immersive storytelling, with stories of the environment baked in to the main body of the shows. And so you understood, if you like, the intention of the characters in each sequence. The reason why we all like soap operas is that we kind of we know we got all the characters in a soap opera marked, and that's how soap operas work. You know how they're going to react in certain situations and what the interaction of those characters is going to be like. You know their intentions, in other words, and then the dramatic edge is always based on when they do something different or whatever. And in natural history, immersive storytelling, sort of understanding the intention of animals is a very difficult thing to do. The most contemporary thing now is to sort of speak of the mind of an animal. We've always underestimated what animals can do. It's suited us. But animals are capable of so much more, we all know, all of them, than we give them credit for. And Blue Planet 2 was the first to start lifting the lid on that. Dolphins self-administering medicines with pharmaceutical plants, this sort of collaboration between octopus and other fish, for example, and things like that. And the combo of that, as well as the natural world is in free fall, a sort of love of nature, a sort of immersion in nature, a sort of understanding of what these animals are up against in their natural lives, and then there's this sort of human component, created this Blue Planet 2 effect with huge audiences. And Chatham House, that was most unusual, because Blue Planet 2 got an Emmy, I think, and it's the most unusual recognition actually that Blue Planet 2 had enormous diplomatic impact around the world, particularly around the plastic pollution case. That's good, and that what a shot to have David Attenborough on one side and the Queen on the other.
Yeah. With the two British icons there.
I did absolutely everything I could to make sure I was in that shot. Because I knew it wouldn't last very long. It's very funny actually when you work terribly hard to make sure you're in the shot. You feel so sort of awful, grubby afterwards. And then the effort it takes for everyone to cut you out of the shot. Because they only want pictures of Attenborough and the Queen.
What was getting to address the UN like? Was there a lot of pressure in the build-up to that?
Yeah, the UN's, that's an interesting experience, and they're all you're speaking to diplomats when you go to the United Nations, and it's just fascinating. You just feel, it's a good moment just to mark the spot with what is called impact producing. And you'll see jobs now, if you advertise, called advertising for impact producers. And impact producers is a brand new job title in the last year or two, really. And what an impact producer is someone who's interested in making a show aimed at a specific and often very specialised audience, and an audience that you want to influence. So, for example, you might want to make something where the audience is United Nations Assembly, and that's the film you're making, to have impact on decision making, and that's what impact producing is all about, and impact researching and impact. And so United Nations was, in some ways, was a bit nerve-wracking, but there's this wonderful feeling of it being such an important audience, and to talk about the value of the natural world, because what we're all trying to do, isn't it, is to bring natural history right to the top of the agenda. I mean, tell me otherwise, but in the recent election we've had in this country where Labour had a landslide, environment wasn't mentioned once by Labour, anyone really, but Labour, it's not there. I didn't hear it once in the US presidential election in any meaningful way, not once. I haven't heard it anywhere in Europe, Spain, Italy, France recently, Romania. It's not on the agenda, and so the United Nations was very important in that respect. It's as good as I could do.
Have you seen any positive changes come as a result?
Not really, because it's often you're just sort of broadcasting to this group of people which you sort of hope makes an impact. I think Sir David made a big impact when he gave I think it's called the Commoners speech to the United Nations at COP26.
Yeah.
And but honestly, the outcome of COP29. The COP26 in Glasgow, which I went to, which was about biodiversity, came up with some important agreements and things. We wonder how these agreements can be delivered. But I mean, basically, but as far as I could tell, with COP29, they're all doing oil deals, weren't they? Behind the scenes. I mean, it was kind of. So so the United Nations, it's very complex, bringing these nations together and getting them focused on a single important thing.
Yeah.
But you've got there's an enormous job at hand to bring the natural world, to the top, and to bring the skills of a naturalist into life, into all of our lives.
On the topic of impact producing and climate change, with the intensification of climate change, do you think scientific communicators have a responsibility to preach essentially a different way of approaching climate activism, or vouching for climate?
I think it's. I think you have to make a decision whether you're the voice or whether you're reporting other voices, and if you're the voice, you become an influencer activist yourself, and you're merely using the broadcast platform to project your view. And if you become a very famous influencer, that might have impact. I would say for most of us, it would have greater impact to try and find a range of specialist voices which you package in the most powerful way that you can, and being in that sort of producer role is immensely influential, and where you're sort of reporting, where you're sort of broadcasting a truth. And if your vision as a producer is to have a very strong message about a different sort of advocacy, then you need to find those people, who can help do that. I'm not saying one is better than t'other, but it's quite a long road to be a highly influential influencer, and you're quite exposed as well.
With your talk about impact producing, before you were obviously talking about keeping your audience engaged with the story, while also keeping the story true to itself.
Yes.
Did you ever, on your big projects or just any of them specific, were you always just preaching to a generalised audience, or do you like to focus on a specific audience or a specific
audience is your audience, so it's terribly important if you want to make stuff to watch stuff. Now, I'm sure you all consume huge amounts of media, so you need to know your audience, and audiences are so much more complex now, and so it's not so much that it's to just a general audience, but it's a sort of general audience that you know the parameters of. So we're making this program because you want it to appeal to sort of prime time on sort of National Geographic streamer, or it has to be a family audience, for Apple TV Plus, or something suitable for prime time BBC One, or it could be much more rarefied, in which case you've tucked it away in another broadcaster or platform, or like a YouTube channel, or on BBC 4 or something like that, or some. And but you need to know who you're making it for, not just a sort of scattergun approach, but the really big shows on major broadcasters have had huge impact. We're very lucky in this country, by the way, because although huge audiences are probably a thing of the past, but to think that Blue Planet 2 got, I think, 13 million at its peak, and a massive audience on Discovery main channel is 3 million, and some Nat Geo shows which are prime time are 500,000. So, but they might run the show 50 times. So it's different, but you have to know your audience and who you're making.
Do you think the rise in streaming services is a good thing for natural history?
It's not a sort of good or bad thing. It is just the reality. That there are so many more ways to publish your work. Everyone thought that the streamers was going to trash terrestrial linear television, if you like, and yet a lot of the streamers now, like Netflix, you've seen it, and Amazon, they're starting to put live events on, aren't they? They kind of want that sort of linear schedule, live stuff. But it must be good, mustn't it? That there are more places to buy your natural history. It can only be good. The more the merrier. You can't have this sort of monolith of a few, a bit like it was, a few terrestrial channels, and I think the streamers have done some good stuff, haven't they?
Oh, definitely. With regards to technology, you must have seen it come on in leaps and bounds during your time at the NHU. If you could go back to one of your earlier projects with a piece of equipment that's available today, what things would you do differently?
Oh God! I witnessed the advance in camera technology underwater. We used to take film underwater. It's so difficult. And then as soon as and Planet Earth 2006 was the first time, wait for this, the first time the Natural History Unit really used video on wildlife filmmaking. Before then, it's all film, celluloid film.
Yeah.
And suddenly, and then Planet Earth 2006, the beginning of it all, as it were, was all done in HD, so 1K, and it was revolutionary. So video digital technology everywhere is better. I mean, honestly, camera traps, incredible. You know, just think what you can do now with. And no one's coming up with sort of amazing sort of fixed rig ideas, but you know, it's not particularly far fetched to sort of super rig a sort of set. Is it like a sort of set of badges or something? You know, just and cover it. You know, so I think all that's what you want.
The Gobi Bear sequence in Asia was incredible.
Yeah.
That was mostly camera traps, I believe.
Camera traps, amazing. We used to have to go to Asda and buy security cameras. They cost about 20 quid each. We'd buy everything they had and then put them out. But you'll know the name because the name has suddenly escaped me. But what are those remote audio devices that you can put out? And scientists, field scientists, put out whole arrays of them. They're called something. You'll know it when you hear it. They're little microphones, self-contained digital microphones that can be put out, you know, like camera traps everywhere. And there's a really cool group of Finnish scientists. These are fairly commonplace, these things, but they're using them to do one of the most comprehensive acoustic studies of Finnish shorebirds and recording sounds that these birds are making to each other and interspecies that have never been heard before. So cool. So it's all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. While we're on technology, a lot of us were at Wildscreen, and one of the more controversial topics that were brought up was AI. Do you see it having a place in natural history?
AI is with us. So you know, how's AI going to work? So it's yes, I was slightly alarmed actually because I'm in the middle of writing something, collaborating with someone who's a real expert in e-learning, and we've got this mission that we want to train lots of naturalists to be sort of embedded in society to get this mission to get natural history right up. And I'm not very familiar with AI, but he puts all these presentations together, which maybe you do, in about 5 minutes just by pressing AI button. He just puts a paragraph in, and then a 20-slide PowerPoint is out. It's just done in that quickly. So AI is going to have enormous role to play in script writing. It's going to have a big role to play in planning. It's going to have a big role to play in how you construct stories and what fits and how you might tell the stories. It's going to be a real sort of companion in that way. AI could be... there's an enormous elephant trap with the word fakery. And natural history works because the audience believe what you're broadcasting. And as soon as you dupe the audience, you're in such trouble, and you should be as well. You know, so if you make things up, things that, you know, behaviours that didn't happen without, or worlds, if you like, that you've constructed without warning the audience that you've constructed this world, unless it's obvious, it's an artifice, you know, and therefore they're seeing it through that. So I can see an enormous danger that that AI might encourage broadcasting unique animal behaviour that didn't happen, or in numbers, or in places. I don't know. But you know, you've got the idea. We have to use it so carefully, don't we? But of course, the thing is, it's not going to go away. So it's more, how do you use AI well?
Yeah. Another thing that was brought up was the idea of an oversaturation of the big landmark documentaries.
Yeah.
We ran as Wild Film a couple of weeks ago an event called Escaping the Blue Chip,
yeah,
which looked at different filmmaking styles
Good.
in wild film. What are your thoughts on audience fatigue with wildlife documentaries and the idea of incorporating different filmmaking styles?
Oh, absolutely. My God, diversity is everything. And absolutely, I mean, you know, the landmarks have probably had their day, this sort of bigness thing. Audiences are craving authenticity. So if you find characters that you can film who are the real thing, they just love that, whether it be a hosted program or just someone that you want to film. Something else that I feel very passionate about, is, for want of a better word, is sort of decolonising natural history. That in country people should be telling as much as possible. We should be helping them. They should be telling their own stories, which is about diversifying the formats and the styles and everything else. So if you think about it, it's been sort of crews from Bristol, sort of going to all sorts of parts of the world, crews from America, all over the place, going to parts of the world, sort of filming their wildlife. It's been legitimate. But it's enormously important that the really key roles, like camera operator and director, are in country, because it's their country, and to get behind your question, we owe it to audiences to offer, to make sure there's that sort of diversity of approach to storytelling, of emphasis. I mean, a Kenyan filmmaker making a film about bats in rural Kenya will be a very, very different film to the one that we would make, I would make.
Because you've got that background where you've already...
Well, I just sort of go there, and it's another country, and I sort of take a view on what's interesting through my sort of visitor's eyes, and someone who lives there. I mean, it's a real example. I mean, they're more familiar with them, and sort of living with them in rural Africa, in rural Kenya. And the story that they would want to tell about those bats is different to the one that we would want to, and it's more authentically Kenyan. So, but absolutely, the super landmark and the funding of the super landmark, I think, is probably over as well.
So with a lot of outsourcing of work as well, and the lack of jobs in the industry, what advice would you give to us young people for wanting to pursue a career in natural history?
Is it feeling very tough at the moment out there? You haven't quite left university yet, have you? But there's been a big decline in work in Bristol. I mean, things go up and down. I mean, if it's any comfort, in my sort of career, I've seen it go up and down 3 times, and this is the 4th time. And and what happened when all the streamers came on board? They were buying everyone's films, BBC films, ITV, all that, and everyone loved it because they were flogging their films to streamers. But then the streamers, very like Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Discovery, all of them, Peacock, they all wanted to future-proof their own catalogues, so they started funding their own natural history docs and series to future-proof their own catalogues, films that they could own, not buy off others. And that, which happened, sort of started happening about 7 years ago, is what created this enormous boom in Bristol in natural history content production. And all the indies, as well as the BBC, were all thriving. I mean, literally hiring. Like when I stepped back from the NHU was over 500 people.
Wow.
So and then the streamers have largely future-proofed their catalogues now. They're commissioning fewer shows. The BBC doesn't have nearly so much money, and other things. And Nat Geo is a huge global brand which still is sort of funding a lot. But the upshot is that fewer big series, are being commissioned. But what is being commissioned is changing. Going back to your question a moment ago about authenticity, did you actually catch up with the film in Shetland, Billy and Molly, that won?
Yes, that was amazing. we saw at Wild
So if you've seen Billy and Molly, Charlie Hamilton James's film, he's a wonderful guy. You must get him in if you haven't spoken to you. But there's a really good example of a documentary style of film, very authentic, built around that holy grail of a wonderful relationship between the animal and the person, where you sort of see where you see the capabilities of the otter and the sort of emotional sort of outpouring that there is. And it's these sorts of things which I believe you need to be looking for. You need to be looking for those sorts of relationships of people and animals which tell you something about the animal minds, about what sort of beings they are. And I think all the networks are looking for that sort of stuff. And it'll be you who'll find them. It'll be you. I used to, years ago, I met somebody in Australia, a boy who'd made friends with a grouper at the end of a jetty. And because groupers are very territorial, and he and the grouper had a genuine friendship.
Wow.
And a book was written about him called Bluefish. And it was long before anyone even thought that could possibly be a film in it. And so I believe these stories exist, and they're the ones. And through that sort of thing, even if it's a bittersweet story, you'll be able to tell some of the sort of wider truths about the world that we live in.
Billy and Molly the filmmakers being from Shetland as well, also means that there's a lot of authenticity.
Yeah. Amazing.
What advice would you give to people trying to pitch to production companies?
Be thorough. So don't. You can sell an idea on a sentence. Actually, you can say, I've developed this camera. I can film a fight between a sperm whale and a giant squid, and I nearly got it. Look at this. And then I promise you'll have a 6-part series, 10 million an episode to go and film it. And all they'll want is the sperm whale and giant squid. So you can sell an idea. That's a sequence that no one's got, and you can sell an idea purely on a line if it's that special. But pitching is all about doing your homework, being sure of what it is that you want to make, and knowing and rehearsing it and doing it enthusiastically and having answers to kind of curveball questions around the idea, so really know your stuff. But to anyone that you're pitching to, the perspective of theirs that you have to be very aware of is that they don't want to risk on a risk. So a lot of broadcasters, platforms will take a risk on you as sort of new talent, if you like, or on the idea which they absolutely love. But if they feel that there's an aspect of the idea that they can't control over and above commissioning you to make it, you won't get it. So you have to take all the risk out of it. So what you can't say is, I need all this money to go and do this, it'll be amazing. This sort of island in the sky, which no one's ever been to. But we don't know whether we'll be able to get up there. We'll find out when we get there, sort of thing. They can't take a risk on a risk, and they never will. And so that's a perspective that you have to have in the back of your mind all the time, and to take the risk out.
I'm conscious of time, but I've got 2 more questions before we open it up. David Attenborough once said that you had one of the most important jobs in the entire world, as you were responsible for, of course, getting the message across to humanity about climate change. That's quite a responsibility. So when you look back at your time in the NHU, do you have any moments that stand out for you? How do you think you did?
I ran, the most important thing that you'll ever have as your careers develop are are how well you treat people. And we all know that some people don't treat others that well, and others can be at the receiving end of bad behaviours. But something I'm really, really proud of, that even though the NHU was hundreds of people, they were really motivated, cared for team, where and I know that I wasn't ever projected as a sort of cat that took the cream, and so the teams really shone. The teams that delivered all those amazing shows really shone as individuals, and they've all gone on to have glittering careers themselves. So that's a really big win.
Yeah.
I've always loved the elegance of speech broadcasting, and it's so lovely to see sort of podcasts being massive now. And so radio has never died. So the Natural History Unit has always been sort of multi-platform. I sort of really much to keep that going.
Yeah.
And all the content. And the other thing that I feel incredibly proud of is that by the end of my tenure there, I think more women were in key roles. They were in producer roles, series producer roles, exec producer roles, all senior roles, and filmmakers themselves. And so that original sort of skew of a sort of very male organisation then became more women actually in senior roles, and I think my God, it's so much better for it.
But you kind of answered the second question as well, but are there any philosophies in life that you found have taken you further in your career?
Treating people well. Yeah, always treating people and being well. You can't keep everyone happy all of the time, but if you treat people well and everyone knows it, it's amazing how much sort of headspace you get, and just being true to yourself, but just passionate about doing this. I come back to this thing again about a desire to get close to nature and a desire to give it a voice. And if you've chosen such a good way to do it. You can do it through science, you can do it through teaching, you can do it through literature. There's lots of ways to do it. But you've decided to use the platform of sort of broadcast, and which has the potential to reach very dynamic audiences, and that's an amazing thing to want to tell a story and to get close yourself and to get them close. So that'd be my advice.
It's brilliant. It's fascinating to hear from you. Thank you. Has anyone got any questions in the audience? Have we had any questions online? Do you want to read one out?
Do you think it's possible / common to get into wildlife film and then go across to film and drama, or do you have to specialise early and focus on wild film?
The person's absolutely right that natural history filmmaking is a real specialism, and so I think it's probably more the other way actually, is that natural history filmmakers, because it's such an important story and the kind of storytelling is getting so sophisticated, sort of like to bring in those with other skills, whether it be documentary skills or drama skills. I think a natural history filmmaker would find it quite difficult to go into drama, but I think it would be not so difficult for drama to come into natural history.
Interesting.
But they'd need natural history people around them, but their storytelling would be very interesting for us.
Any other from the audience? Any more online?
Do you think having to sell a story takes away from the ability to communicate science effectively?
Simplifying a story, I think actually that's a challenge, because I think I've always wanted to come into a science department like here in University of Bristol, And you say there's a science and communication masters.
Yes.
But it's become incredibly important for scientists to be able to tell a story well and to try and view their audience as being more than just maybe the readership of a journal they might publish in. So I would say it's a challenge to be able to tell the science simply but accurately, but it has to be simple. Does it take away the nuance of all the science? It probably takes away some of the detail, and some of the generalisms would probably grate. But then it goes back to my sort of comments about impact producers. When a scientist is writing a paper, the readership of that paper, unless it's something like New Scientist or something, tends to be a very specialist readership of that journal and is very interested in the progress of the research in real detail. And that's significant. That's the process of science. It's a collective endeavour. Broadcast is about, on the whole, unless its impact is on the whole about reaching broad audiences with ideas. So I think there has to be a bit of give and take, and generalisms have to be allowed.
Brilliant.
Brian Cox is a pretty good example of making the impossible very possible. I mean, honestly, have you seen some of his work, sort of explaining sort of planetary science? I mean, I know he's amazing. He's an amazing broadcaster.
Go on.
You talked about getting more women into the industry. I wonder if there's also kind of stereotype of being quite a rich person in the industry as well, who's got to support herself quite a lot and you know, buying camera equipment. Do you think that's changed, or if it's still got quite a long way to go?
I think it's. You're right. You know, the organisations that I work for, I know, looked impenetrable from the outside, and there was a bit of a sort of sense of, you know, private school, well-heeled backgrounds, sort of going in. I think I genuinely think it's different now. But you're absolutely right. Is that, you know, the natural world, you know, to use that expression, is a global commons. It belongs to all of us, and we all have perspectives on it. And watching or hearing those perspectives is absolutely vital to us all. And so those from different and lower sort of socioeconomic backgrounds and different backgrounds altogether have to find a way, and that is absolutely changing with, that has changed with the increase in platforms available in which to publish work, but also a recognition by the really big companies that that diversity really matters, and making a big effort. It was shocking in the past. You hit a real truth, but it's much better now.
Any other questions on that?
Yeah. How important is it to have scientific knowledge versus filmmaking and narrative skills to get into the industry?
Just it all depends on the role, and I'll come back to that thing again. You need to be scientifically literate, don't you, in natural history? You need to be able to speak it so you can get to the nub of the story. But television itself is a technical business, but I don't think you need camera skills and things like that to be a producer. I think you need to be aware what camera operators bring to it all, and sound operators bring to it all, and editors bring, and colorists bring, and mixers bring. And so I don't think you need all of them. But with natural history, you either need to know your natural history, have strong field skills, or can link scientific knowledge to the field. So I think it is a specialism.
Any other questions from the audience? One of the things I was wondering, when, especially amongst the biologists in my head, when there's a real interest in the biodiversity crisis.
Yes.
And when we watch the blue chips, there's a lot of feeling of being overwhelmed, or there's not much you can do. From your perspective, as someone who has quite quite an influence in that world. Where are we at in terms of climate change?
Climate change particularly, I think, climate change and biodiversity loss are two different things. There's been so much effort with climate change messaging that I think that the public kind of understand, that the global temperature is not allowed to rise, above 1.5, and that's going to go above that, isn't it? And then 2.5. It's almost like this sort of countdown thing on an action movie. They've kind of got it, but actually the science behind climate change, I believe, is incomprehensible still to the public. Not enough has been done on it, except that we will have to reduce our carbon. And still, sort of visions of a low carbon world, I don't think abound everywhere. The biodiversity crisis, unlike climate change, could be arrested tomorrow. Could be, with the right action taken, things could be better tomorrow. But they're so complex and uniquely complex to each location and each problem. And it's impossible for audiences to understand it all. And in terms of the kind of feel-goodness, it's very hard to get any sort of feel-good around climate change, except that governments, if they really do want to do something, can do something. You might not remember. Do you remember the ozone hole that formed, that was spotted over the Antarctic and everything else? Well, governments came together quite quickly and closed it quite a bit. It shows what governments can do when they think that something's going to completely trash them tomorrow. And the climate change, they're all, With biodiversity, it's massively difficult because of all the complexity all over the world. But that comes down to this thing that I think there have to be more. I think all of us, everyone, has to bring natural history into our working lives. What an advocate of this calls nature literacy. In any job that you do, you need to have a knowledge of natural history so that your work and the decisions you might make in work, decisions which you are given to make, will have the natural world sort of in the back of your mind. I think that's the only way.
Brilliant.
With your experience, obviously you said like pioneering radio science communication, and then like on different platforms and stuff, and the importance of being a science communicator in some ways more important than the research itself, getting that out to the general public, and like you say, people don't understand the science behind lots of it. How have you found audiences differ in taking on the information on different platforms, and like what do you find is the best avenue if you're purely just trying to be a science communicator?
Gosh, I think it's it all depends what you're communicating, isn't it? So with a platform like YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, or with most of those things, you're communicating something pretty fast and furious. There's no gentle sort of pan up, fade up music, and then 30 seconds later someone starts saying something. I mean, someone would have swiped and long before you got to that stage. And so the message that you want to tell might be suitable for a platform like that, where you come in really hard, do something really fascinating, grabs people, and then you start building an audience around it, and then you can add more to it. If you want to really explain a sort of complex area like climate change, you might need the documentary hour plus in a series with narrative and storytelling that allows you to give that detail and hold the audiences, which comes back to the sophisticated sort of emotional storytelling, where you are gripped. So I think it's all there. There's no better. There's There are many arrows in the quiver now.
Brilliant, thanks Julian. I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for coming in, it's been really good.
Thank you. Good.